wonderful to be in Montana. I lived very briefly in Bozeman as a child before it became a very big city, and have been through here a lot doing research for this novel. So before I start talking about the novel, I always like to do a land acknowledgement. It's particularly pertinent to the meaning of the book. Indigenous people have inhabited the valley in which Helena is situated for more than 12,000 years. The valley acting as a crossover for Salish, Crow, Bannock, and Blackfeet tribes, among others. This is the Bray's normal acknowledgement. I would add the Nez Perce, who are a very important part of this story, all of whom came through here on the way to Buffalo. One of the things that I've read, and I think is important to say, a South Dakota organization says that land acknowledgement without action does not address the systemic issues facing Indigenous people. So look around, see who lived on the place that you live and work, and if you can support organizations and activities and programs financially, that would also be meaningful. This is important because this is a wonderful map from Canada showing the many different Indigenous peoples in just a part of the North American continent, because of course before the miners and the settlers and the ranchers, there were many, many, many different people of different cultures living on this land. And this novel, The Shining Mountains, is about a very particular slice of this pre-American world, from the Pacific Ocean, the Columbia watershed, to the Rocky Mountains. It was called the Oregon Country, and I'm going to explain to you, what that meant. It was a very large chunk of land. This is just a slide of Fort Nez Perce, which was controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company, the Canadian, actually it was British fur trading operation that began way back east, actually, in the 17th century, 18th century, and moved ever westward. So by the time the story that I'm telling arrives, they were in control of almost all of what is today Western Canada, and Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and half of Montana, and had trading forts there for fur. So this novel is the story of what I consider kind of a largely forgotten world of blended multicultural families who were thrown together by this trade in fur. What it was white, mostly Scottish Highland fur traders who took native wives and had very large families. Some went back to Scotland at the end of the fur period, but many, many stayed here and had big families, many of whom's descendants live in this region still. And the fur trade, just as a kind of point of interest, the reason we even had the beaver fur trade is that there was a huge demand in London for top hats made of beaver pelt. So that's what the trade was about, was bringing all these furs to the ships, which went down the Columbia and around the Horn to London, to the hatters and the haberdashers to make top hats. I became interested in it because it's the story of my family. My family was deeply involved. I am descended from the brother of Angus MacDonald, who was the last fur trader for the Hudson Bay Company in what would become the United States. So Angus, as I said, he was my great uncle. And like almost all of the men who worked for the Hudson Bay at that time, he married a native woman. And her name was Catherine Baptiste. She was Nez Perce on her mother's side, and on her father's side she was a mixture of Mohawk and French, because her father worked for the company as well as a trapper. So she was what they called a daughter of the fur trade, and there were many of these, as the generations went by, more and more families were mixed race people. So their story is remarkable. It's a story of long love. They were married 4 different times. They had 12 children. They stayed together. They lived all around, and I'm going to give you a historical account of the real people in a minute, but the story that I tried to tell in this is fiction. I fictionalized the reality, and the luck I had was that they were prominent. And so in Helena at the Montana Historical Society, in Missoula at the Mansfield Library, in Pullman, Washington, there's just lots and lots of documents. So it was very, I wouldn't say easy, but it was possible to chart their real lives. And then on top of it, then to try to tell the story. And what it ended up being was a story of resilience and survival, because this was a family that was right at the center of so many momentous things that happened here from the late 1840s to 1870. This was the period in which westward expansion happened. The treaties were made with the tribes. The Native people were moved to reservations. And this family, the short tagline, the elevator pitch is, it's a family caught in the crossfire of manifest destiny, because they were a mixed family. And her family were deeply involved in hunting and then affected by the gold rushes, which I'll explain in a minute. But before, I think that's all I wanted to say. Well, it covers 2 generations, 40 years. It starts in 1838, when Angus, in fact, came from Scotland to the Columbia River, and then eventually came to Montana in a little while. I'll explain how. And it goes all the way through, from the 1840s through the 1850s, that period of conquest, and then through the Nez Perce War of 1877, which I know in the Missoula area, in the Bitterroot area, is very familiar because the Nez Perce came through that area. I'm not sure how many people in Helena know the whole story, so I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. But it was it was the so-called last Indian War. Yes and no, but in any case, the Nez Perce were chased across nearly 1,200 miles of U.S. territory to Bear Paw, up in eastern Montana, just before the border. So that's what the book is about. I'm going to first thank my descendants, my cousins. I have all of these cousins who are Native American named McDonald, most of whom live on the Flathead Reservation, but some of whom live on the Nez Perce Reservation. And I could never have written this book if I hadn't had their support and their advice and assistance, particularly in formally requesting permission from the tribes to do this research. As a non-Native person, it was really important to me to make sure that I honored their culture, didn't exploit it, and reflected it as well as I could. But again, our family is a mixed family of Scottish Highlanders and Nez Perce people, so it was a really challenging and interesting process. So now we'll move a bit into the real people that the book is based on, and then I'll read a little bit from the novel at the end. But this is a picture of Angus MacDonald. He fled the Scottish Highlands. He didn't just get on a boat. He actually had to run the story in all 3 branches of the families that he poached something from the lairds. So it was the period of the Highland clearances, which was another colonial difficulty for the Scots, because the English took over the Scottish Highlands and pushed off the people and put sheep there instead. So he apparently poached something, and he got put lickety-split on a boat for North America because his great uncle Archibald was already here working as a fur trader for the Hudson Bay Company. And he was at Fort Colville on the Columbia River, which I have a picture of in a minute. But the main thing was, when he got there, he met his uncle, his great uncle, who was also married to a Native woman. They had a big family. So Angus perceived what it was like to live this fur trade life. He spent his 2 years there, 2 winters there, learning all the languages, the Sishaptan languages, the Salish languages, which proved very, very helpful in his career as a fur trader later. And then in 1840, he was transferred to Fort Hall on the Snake River, which is near present-day Pocatello, Idaho. It was the company's furthest southeast kind of bastion against the American fur traders. So, you have to think this is the British against the Americans at this point. And this is where he met Catherine Baptiste. Now, she was a remarkable person. She was a daughter of the fur trade. These are her ancestors, her cousins, her uncles. We don't know the exact relationship, but these were 3 very important Nez Perce chiefs during the Nez Perce War. You've probably heard of Chief Looking Glass, Eagle from the Light, and Chief Whitebird. And these were all relatives of hers through her mother, who was a very powerful woman, it seems, Margaret Denai. Her name in Nez Perce, which is Nimipu, is Tipulena Kitala, which means the eagle rising up. And as you can see, Eagle from the Light is also Tipulena. A lot of the people in her family had that eagle as part of their name. When she was much, much older, this is her on the left. Probably it was taken in southeastern Washington, because one of the people, when I was in Colfax, Washington, recognized the name of the photo studio. So it was probably taken when they were posted in Washington State at Fort Colville, probably in the early 1860s. So by then she was a woman of mature years, 40, 45. She'd probably had at least 8 or 9 children. But I wanted to show pictures of their daughter, Christina, to give you an idea of how beautiful Catherine probably was as a young woman. Because Christina on the right, at age 23, was called the Belle of Colville, because by then there was an army garrison there and all the soldiers wanted to go to the parties and dance with Christina. So the Hudson Bay Company itself called this whole area the Columbia District, and it was headquartered at Fort Vancouver, which is in present-day Portland. And there were literally scores and scores of trading posts scattered all over this huge, huge region. And it was run mostly by Scottish Highlanders, which is a really interesting phenomenon. I'm not exactly sure why. But the traders lived in these forts, usually just 1 or 2 men and some quote servants who were mixed race people, a lot of Hawaiians, because the HBC had a trade triangle with Hawaii too, so there were native Hawaiians in the Northwest too. And they would bring their furs down to these posts. The trappers would come and trade, and the Hudson Bay Company had, all of the European wares, plates, knives, cloth, guns, all of these things which they traded for these furs to go on to onto London. And so almost to a man, these men, they married native women. And the name of the relationship was called à la façon du pays, in the custom of the country. So these were what we would consider common law marriages. And it was common from 1819 up through about 1850. And this is just sort of a European representation of kind of romanticized of what these looked like. But for me, writing the novel, it was really interesting challenge to understand why, particularly the Nez Perce, would allow their daughter to marry this fur trader. I could understand why the fur traders would want to marry the native women because of the knowledge and survival in the land. But it turned out that particularly as westward expansion continued, there was just so much more pressure on the tribal peoples. They were being pushed into smaller areas, competing for resources and game. Having the guns was important. The Blackfeet had a lot of guns. The Blackfeet warred extensively with the Salish and the Nez Perce over the hunting grounds, the buffalo grounds here. So it was of great advantage. They were sort of like, I think of them as these European marriages, in the 15th, 16th century. They were dynastic kind of political marriages to make sure that people would survive. So one little funny story is, this is the head of the whole Columbia District, John McLaughlin, and he too was married to a native woman named Marguerite. And the story goes is about mid-1850s, the company policy shifted because the Victorian era had begun and the mores shifted, and at the company's highest levels, they decided it was no longer okay to be married to native women. It was somehow not considered seemly, and they actually sent a reverend, a Protestant, to Fort Vancouver to sort of say, okay, you have to marry her again because it's not legit, this marriage. You have to regularize it in the church at the very least. And McLaughlin was so incensed because he'd been married to her for 30 years that he punched him out in the fort yard. So Angus had a very illustrious career. This is his chart at the Hudson Bay Company of how he rose through the ranks through all of these different postings. And the picture on the left was taken in 1865, right at the end of the Civil War, right after the Civil War, when finally the Hudson's Bay Company was ejected from the United States. What had happened was in 1846, Britain and America agreed on the international boundary at the 49th parallel. And interestingly, from 1846 to 1865, almost 20 years, kind of nothing happened because there was a negotiation over the value of all their properties. The Hudson Bay Company wanted the US to pay them for all these properties. And then the Civil War happened, and by the time they got around to finalizing the whole thing, it was 1865. And Angus had been and was by that time the chief trader at Fort Colville. He was the highest ranking, last man standing, basically. Everyone else, pretty early on in the late 1840s, it was clear the writing was on the wall. So the company moved its headquarters to Victoria, British Columbia, and left these guys here just to keep the business running while the negotiations went on. So he was a kind of I have a line in there where he's very frustrated and lonely, and he's sort of like a tin pot king. He's the king of a vast empire, but the empire's shrinking around him. the Americans have come to take over. But he was a really interesting character. It was really easy to write about him and make a wonderful story because he left a lot of letters, as I said. But he was also renowned as the line is a minor poet and a major carouser, because he loved to play, as his daughter wrote in her memoirs, the Scottish laird. And Fort Colville was the biggest thing around. There were not that many European places where people could come and wine and dine. And so he wined and dined all of the territorial officials, all of the army people, all of the chiefs, and was well known and well liked. He had to operate kind of in the middle. He was a great shot, apparently, a real good marksman, and he was also a loving husband and father. He was really, really enamored of the native way of life, and it may be because of the Scottish clan system and the Indian band system are very parallel structures of cultures. He loved to hunt. He went on many hunts with the Salish. And in fact, one of the Hudson Bay clerks described him as, quote, excessively fond of the Aboriginal way of life. He played the bagpipes, he danced the sword dance. He was a wild man. And in the winter times, he wrote his life stories and exploits in these big ledger books that the Hudson Bay Company had, one of which is at the Mansfield Library in Missoula, which I have held and read. And it's important to note that besides Angus and his illustrious life, Catherine was a remarkable person in her own right. She went with her father, who was a trapper. Before she met Angus, she had gone on a year-long expedition trapping beaver down the Colorado River all the way to Baja, California, starting in Idaho, and came back and survived, And she, at one point in one of those long winter nights, she told Angus the story of this trip, and he wrote it down. And so it was published in a historical quarterly in Oregon or Washington sometime in the mid-20th century. So we know what she did. She freed some people who had been taken slaves. She helped dig water for the horses. It was a rough trip. So she was extremely tough. And the other thing, I just came from the Fort Connor Rendezvous, which is up on the Flathead, which is a celebration of Fort Connor, which is the place they mostly lived, where her great-grandson told this story, which I had also heard, that she had every one of those children by herself in the woods. And the reason was the Nez Perce believed that a child that comes into the world without assistance will be stronger. So the women would literally go off into the bush, bear their children, I guess tie their umbilical cords, and come home with the baby. So she was really something else. Quickly, I will just run through some of the forts that you'll meet in the course of the book. I do provide maps, because I think in historical fiction, it's like, where are they again? What are they doing? So I showed you this one, but for each, there are 3 different books in the book, and I provide a map because they just ranged across the most vast territory, So Fort Hall it was made of adobe. The thing that's interesting about it is it was the last bastion of the Hudson Bay Company, but by 1843, the vast wagon trains on the Oregon Trail had started coming across. And the first European settlement they met was a British trading post, which some of them took offense at. Said, what are you people doing here? And in fact, apparently one settler climbed into the fort leader's bed and said, well, you'll be out of here soon enough. I'm just going to rest in your bed. But Angus, they were canny business people. They would buy their completely exhausted horses off these wagoners and settlers and plump them up and sell them at a profit. They were business people. But Angus also had a pretty soft heart, I think. He drew a map for the first emigrants, showing them how to get to the Willamette Valley, where they could find water, because he took the furs out twice a year along that Snake River Road, and he knew how to get there. So, in later life, he disliked Americans intensely, but in the beginning, he was a generous person. And then again, this is just the Fort Vancouver, which was the headquarters of the whole business. You should go there if you're ever in Portland, because it's fantastic. They did archaeological digs and they've reconstituted it, and it's really extraordinary. Angus never was posted there, but he brought the furs there. And he happened to be there when it burst into flames in 1844. And again, he really earned a lot of points with the boss because he helped put the fire out. They soaked Hudson Bay blankets in water and hung them on the eaves. And then this is Fort Connor. This is really the key point of the book, because Angus founded this fort in 1846. It's on the Flathead Reservation just north of St. Ignatius on Highway 93. It is believed to be the oldest surviving structure in the state of Montana. There was nobody else here except fur traders who was white. It was just native people and then these early fur trades. The irony is it was built the same year that they agreed on the international boundary. And so it lived this sort of limbo existence for 20 years. It sort of wasn't officially there, but they kept trading out of it. And it's in the homelands of the Kootenai and the Salish and the Kalispel. And Angus built it actually in 1847. And I just want to point out that they're all called forts, but hardly any of them are fortified. They're really just trading posts. But for some reason, they liked the name. They thought it made it sound a little bit grander, maybe. And this is Fort Colville, which is unfortunately now underwater because they built the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia. And you can see on that big bench there at the river on the left, it was a very big farm. It was on a fertile plain. Archibald, Angus's great uncle, built that farm and made it into this amazing, it had to supply the whole interior, all the interior posts with timber and boats and food and everything. So it was a very big farm. And it was abandoned in 1871. That was the year that everything closed down and everyone had to move north of the border because it was no longer British trading territory. Angus tried to stay there actually, but the government wouldn't let him because they wanted the land for the Colville Indian Reservation, which is, now it's underwater, so the point is moot. But interestingly, during the Civil War, right after the first Yakima War actually, the US government created a garrison 6 miles away called Fort Colville, but they spelled it with 2 L's. So that's just a little tidbit for your next kind of quiz night is the Colville with 1 L is the name of a governor of the Hudson's Bay Company. But I guess when the Americans got here, they thought, no, it can't have 1 L, so they threw another L in there. And they apparently referred to Angus MacDonald's fort as Mac's old pile of logs, which, by then it was probably pretty beat up. And then, whoops, what happened? Uh-oh, let's try again. Oh, this one just doesn't want to show up, which is so weird. All right, anyway, it's just Fort Nisqually, which is a post outside Tacoma. That was a place that Angus went. What happened was, I'll give you a brief, the Indian Wars are so long and complex, but in 1853, while Angus and his family were at Fort Colville, Isaac Stevens, the first governor of Washington Territory, which was, it stretched all the way from here to the Pacific. It was enormous Washington Territory. He was sent here by Congress to make deals with the Indians for land, to clear the land for settlement. And that's where all of the treaties that were made in 1855 stemmed from that first visit. And Stevens stopped at Colville. He had dinner with them. Everybody's journals report on how much was drunk and stuff like that. But those treaties, the Hellgate Treaty, the treaty with the Nez Perce, all of those things began to create the conflict that erupted in first the Yakima War and then later the Nez Perce War. Most of it really caused by the discoveries of gold. So there's sort of 2 things that happen in parallel. The reservation system is created and the people are encouraged to go or forced to go. But at the same time, gold is discovered, often on their lands. And the government is powerless or incapable of preventing the miners from swarming the lands that are technically supposed to be reservation lands for the native peoples. Whereupon they get angry, there are reprisals, there are fights, and then everything erupts. And so in the Yakima War, that happened in 1858, 1859 in southeastern Washington. Angus sent his family here to Montana. He sent them sometimes to Three Forks, just to get them out of the trouble, out of the difficulty. And then by the end of it, in the mid-1860s, things had died down. He sent his oldest son, Duncan, back here to Montana to run Fort Connor, and he stayed in Colville for another few years until the whole thing was over. And I think of it, I imagine it as a really painful time for him. This is even before the Nez Perce War, but the Nez Perce Reservation, for example, in Idaho was 10 times as large as it is today. That was the original treaty. And then gold was found on their reservation and the government cut it. And a part of the tribe agreed, but not all of the tribe, to cut it to 1/10 of its size. you know, so they were left a tiny little bit, and then all the gold miners built Orofino and Pierce and all those towns. So he felt very, very frustrated, very bitter. He sided with his wife's family and his people, and he just felt that the Americans were treachery was a part of how we dealt with Native people, which I think is probably quite true. So he went back to Fort Connor himself in 1871, and this is their son Duncan MacDonald, who's the reason I wrote the whole book in the first place, because Duncan, who is half Scots and half Nez Perce, like all the rest of the family, he settled on the Flathead and was adopted into the Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes. But he himself was a trader initially, and he ended up being a hotelier, and he worked, you know, helping site the railroad. He helped select the site for the bison range on the reservation. Very important person. But in 1878, for the only person in history really, he was asked by the Deer Lodge newspaper to write a series of accounts of the Nez Perce War from the Native perspective. So he wrote, I think, 16 dispatches, like every other week. It took like a year and a half for these to go. And what he did is he interviewed all his relatives, his surviving relatives, and then he came through Helena and he went to Canada, where the surviving Nez Perce had escaped from the army, and they were living up with Sitting Bull, who had fled after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So you had this entire Native community camped across the international boundary, and Duncan MacDonald went up there and interviewed everybody and wrote these amazing dispatches that, as I said, nobody had ever heard the story from their point of view before. So that was, my brother's a scholar, and he discovered these documents. He discovered it. They've since been published in a couple of books, and he brought it to me at my house in London and said, hey, here's your next novel. And I was like, oh my God. And then it kind of grew and grew, because I realized that Duncan was fascinating, and the Nez Perce War was fascinating, but even equally fascinating was his parents and that world. And for me, writing it, and I hope for you when you read it, it's something no one ever taught us in school. You know, it was sort of like it went from Lewis and Clark to the Nez Perce War, and there wasn't much in between, you know, unless you're really interested in history and you go read historical accounts. I didn't have any good sense of how the process occurred. And, you know, steps are made, choices are made, policies are made, and people were, you know, were stripped of their rights, really. So it's been a really, really amazing experience to write this book. So I'm just gonna, I think, take a minute and read a couple little things, and then we can do questions if that works for everybody. Here's a picture of me and Angus's and Catherine's great-grandson, Joe MacDonald, in the family cemetery, where we just were this past weekend. It's at Fort Connor, it's on the reservation. And Angus believed in education. When he came from from Scotland, he had the entire collected Shakespeare in his chest, along with his bagpipes. And he also started the first school in Montana, is what people say, because he hired tutors for his kids and for the other children of the management in the Hudson Bay Company. And it's continued on in the family, because Joe MacDonald founded Salish Kootenai College, and is a really important person. And his whole family, I mean, they're many PhDs, many educators. I was very proud to get to know them. I just sort of parachuted in one day and introduced myself to Joe, and he welcomed me into the family, because they didn't know that much about the Scottish side of their family beyond the Scotsman, as they called him. So I was able to fill them in a bit on how their family, where they were in the Highlands of Scotland, outside Inverness and stuff. So that was fun. I'm just going to read to you a little funny snippet of a scene. Again, I had to imagine their courtship and their marriage. They were married 4 times. I think I mentioned that. The first time by tribal custom, second time at Fort Hall by Angus's boss, Richard Grant, and then twice by Jesuit priests. One in 48 in Montana at Fort Connor by Father Jose, and then in 1854 by Father Rivali at Fort Colville. Because, you know, the Jesuits were sending their priests around to their different missions too. So he kept running into Rivali all over the place. It was really quite amazing. But anyway, I didn't have any hard factual knowledge on how that betrothal and asking her for her hand would work. So I imagined that they wouldn't give up a daughter like Catherine without setting a test, sort of like in the time-honored tradition of, if you want the princess's hand, you have to perform some fun. So they sent him on a buffalo hunt, or they invited him to join them on a winter hunt in Yellowstone, where the Nez Perce did hunt buffalo. And I have a fairly gory little buffalo hunting scene, because in the winter it's pretty gory. And Angus is actually kind of offended by the fact that they don't take all the meat, they just take the robes and leave most of the carcasses there. So that'll be referenced in this. And the other thing you need to know is that the word Nimipu is the Nez Perce name for themselves. And Soyapu means white man. It literally means man with a hat. And I think that's it. So I'm just going to read this little bit. This is after the hunt. That night they feast. The women have butchered at least one of the bloody hulks, Angus is relieved to see. Soon the smell of roasting fat is smoky caramel in eyes and noses. Dogs wriggle toward the fire. His stomach growls. He sees her finally across the hubbub at the fire and feels his neck hairs lift. She's laughing in a ring of bright, lean faces, dark eyes snapping, white teeth flashing. Among these young Nimipu of both sexes, she stands out, he thinks. She is admired. She'll want one of her own kind, not a white man, a Soyapo, he thinks, his spirit sinking. How he loathes the word. It's much too close to one that means it stinks. All evening he waits for a word from her uncle, any kind of sign. Watching, he sees that she speaks little, though others listen when she does. There's something grave about her, he thinks. They traveled and trapped for nearly a year, Baptiste told him. Even as hardy as his own sisters are, he can't quite see them doing that. Memories stir him then, the grand old stories of yore, and he leaps to his feet, decided. A peacock displays, he thinks, and so can I. He slips to his tent, then into the trees, blowing softly into the bag. He pats the hard leather as it groans and stirs. By the time it's done bleeding, the natives have gone silent, faces turned toward the peculiar sound. He steps out of the shadow, fingers skirling, left arm pumping the inflated bag. He serenades her with the sweet maid of Mull. A lilting tune, though as he draws breath he has to smile. Half of them cover their ears, the rest shrink as he passes. The bagpipes are piercing, of course, but therein lies their beauty, the pageantry, the sheer peculiar blast of sound. It's not unlike their wailing cries above the drums. Young George is tapping his right hand on his crossed legs, by now familiar with this caterwauling. Then Eagle from the Light stands and starts to jig in place, a wicked grin across his face. Angus stops before Catherine Baptiste and shifts to the tune he loves best, The Flower of Scotland. Young George starts to clap, elbowing the men beside him, lifting his hands to show them how. Most look uncertainly around, then shrug and smile and start to clap as well. If only his kin could see him now, serenading all these dark and shining faces. The tune breaks off abruptly as they do. In that stunned silence, he gives her a slight bow. So that's that. How are we doing for time? Are there any questions? Would you like me to read more? What's our interest? Happy to answer questions. There's many, many pieces to it. Sure.
Did Angus have other relatives in Scotland who came over, or was he the only family? I know he had one here.
Yeah, no, he was the only one who came over. It seems that his father's cousin was a man named Finan MacDonald, who came much earlier, sort of at the same time as his great uncle, about 1819 with the Northwest Company, which was a kind of a predecessor. So, but no, Angus and his brother, my ancestor Duncan, had 2 or 3 sisters, and the rest of the family stayed in Dingwall, actually, is where they were, north of Inverness. And they actually fell upon really, really hard times. They ended up in the almshouse, which is sort of the poorhouse, and I have some letters back and forth. We do have some letters between the 2 branches of the family. What was really amazing is that when Angus and Catherine, they had all these children, and then one was called Angus Colville, they called him. His wife died young and left him with 4 little girls to raise, and he didn't know what to do, so he asked his sister Maggie to write to my great-great-grandmother Maggie in Scotland and ask her to send a girl to help out. And so one of my great-great-aunts, Christie, came to the Montana in 1910 to help raise these little children, you know, and she told stories to her daughter's still alive, she's in her 90s, and that's how we knew that we knew a bit about the family history. We knew a lot about Archibald, because Archibald is famous because his son Ranald was famous, Ranald MacDonald. There are, all through Washington State, there are memorials to him because he was the first American to shipwreck himself off the coast of Japan. And he opened up Japan for Americans. So, you know, they had kind of storied lives. And when I was 14, I made a family tree. My grandmother told us these stories. You know, of course, at those days, you're young and impressionable. You think, oh, they're all princesses, you know. But they were the daughters of the head men. So they were, in a way, princesses. You know, they were important people in their communities. Yeah. Sure. I think I'll read one more little thing from Catherine's point of view. I really wanted to try to give women their due in history because they're very rarely in the archives. And it was lucky that Catherine told her story to Angus and he wrote it down. He wrote it in kind of very florid Victorian language, which probably wasn't hers, but the material was there. But I was also really lucky because the Nez Perce, at one point, I think in the 60s, there was an anthropologist who came, who was a woman from India, the subcontinent of India, and she really seemed to connect with all of these women on the Nez Perce Reservation. She did years of research and published this amazing book on the women's lives in the Nez Perce tribe, which was essential. You know, I could probably not have done it otherwise. And I just felt like, you know, we never hear from the women, and frankly, they were incredibly tough. You know, and particularly in the fur trade, you know, if you read all the memoirs of all these fur traders, you know, all of them relied on their wives to feed them in the winter, you know, to keep them warm. They didn't know how to survive in these incredibly cold, like, you know, one of the more horrifying things is that when you're in the middle of a blizzard going across the pass here, you know, you would have to kill an elk and sleep inside its entrails to stay alive overnight. There's stuff like that. So, I just wanted to kind of imagine what it was like for the Native people when the Americans came in. And so, as I said, in 1853, the family were all at Fort Colville when Isaac Stevens came through, surveying for a railroad with this mandate to move the Indians off. And he did have dinner at the fort, and he wrote about it in his memoirs, and different people wrote. Angus wrote about it. Catherine didn't write about it, but I imagine how she might have felt after this dinner at which, you know, these American people show up and start talking about how verdant the valleys are. I have to read you what Stevens actually said. It kind of gives you a sense. This is his message to the fellow citizens of the Legislative Assembly of the Territory of Washington, published in the Pioneer at Olympia in April 1856. I have an abiding confidence in the future destiny of our territory. Let us never lose sight of the resources, capacities, and natural advantages of the territory of Washington, which includes Helena, right? We have an interior soon to be filling up with settlements. Gold in considerable quantities has been discovered in the northern part of that interior. There are fine grazing tracts and rich agricultural valleys, and that interior will fill up when these Indian difficulties are at an end. So that was his point of view. This is Catherine. They don't see her. These white men look straight through her as if she's a ghost. Even curiosity is better. At least they see the children. They stare at them, in fact, trying to see which part of them is Angus, which is her, what kind of creatures these might be. Breeds, they call them. Breeds, their blood crossed like that of the horses the Namipu breed, for strength and speed, resilience. She feels sometimes as if she's fading away, paling like the moon when the sun arrives each morning. She watches the sky through the smoke hole in her lodge, remembering the tale of the warrior who died, only to return to his wife's lodge and hang right above it. He couldn't get to the sky world unless she burned his possessions. Woman, you must let me go, he said, or I will take you with me. He was a shade stuck between the worlds, like she. When this Stevens looked through her, he saw only the land on which she stood. He and his kind do not actually perceive her or any of her people. She's the daughter and niece of great medicine women and chiefs. How dare he not see her? She was filled with rage when she left the table and had to walk for some time in the fields, around the horse park, before anything like peace returned. She whistled for the dappled gray whose coat in moonlight shines like silver. He laid his nose between her hands, and she felt calmer. Even Angus is different with these people. There was something in him tonight she didn't recognize. He was animated, like always in company, with her people on the plains, every New Year's when he plays the Lord and his whistling bag. But tonight was different. She felt pulled from him, a string stretching out like the fibers of a bow. How easily he stands in that world that does not see her. And then she tells her children, just at the end of this scene, she tells her children Nez Perce folktale. The older children are shining with excitement at the visitors encamped across the fort. Each of them hugs her hard, even her big boy, John. They nestle close, and she tells them the first story that rises in her mind, the one about the homesick boy. The story that comes, her mother always says, is the story you need to hear. East Country Boy was living with his sister's husband's people across the mountains, but missed his home in the West. Catherine speaks slowly, watching her children's eyes. The boy's family sewed him into an elk skin and sent him back to his western home. He was not to look out until they were past the 5 mountains. But he heard the sounds of buffalo and elk and other animals beside him and chewed a hole and looked. The animals fled back east. The next time they sewed him in a buffalo robe, even tougher to chew through. But again, just before the 5th mountain, his curiosity overcame him. He chewed a hole, and the animals fled east, which is why there is no big game west of the Great Mountains. As she tells it, she's the homesick boy, stitched fast into the skin, unseen. Only instead of animals, it is white men who gallop in the night beside them, up and over all the 5 mountains. And it is she, just before the 5th mountain, who will use her sharp teeth to chew the hole, which will open up their world again and send the whites back to the east where they belong. Her children listen intently, their dark eyes fixed upon her strong white teeth. Yoxkalo, she says, that's all. That's it. And that's it. That's all. Thank you.